Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Kevin Dindalk. I'm the director of the Henry Institute here at Calvin College, which is a research and civic engagement institute. And you are at the Proust Rule of Law lecture. I think this is, I didn't look this up, but I think this is our 7th annual Proust Rule of Law lecture. I just want to say at the start that we have a metaphorical empty seat today. The namesake of this lecture, Don Proust, passed away in early September. Don was a longtime member of the business department here at Calvin and had a long-time interest, I think a lifetime interest, in the rule of law and this key value and set of structures that are so important to our legal and political and economic practices. And so I will miss our times together. I think he would visit me a couple of times a year, and we'd have coffee, and he'd always come with a folder, and it would be filled with clippings from magazines and newspapers of the latest horror when it comes to the rule of law. I think he wanted sometimes to have a lecture on every one of those examples that he would bring in. But those were always engaging conversations, and this is a really great legacy in his memory. I'd like to thank a few people who are partnering in that legacy. So Ed and Ruth Zielstra, who have been involved as partners in this from the very beginning in sponsoring this lecture. Ed was a student of Don's and has been very gracious in his sponsorship. I also want to recognize Dirk Proust, who carries on the Proust name in the business department here at Calvin. And after having joined Calvin, when did you join?
4 years ago.
4 years ago. So has been increasingly a staple with us here at these lectures. Also want to recognize Bill Alphanar, who is also helping to support the lecture here today. And welcome to all of you. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Rod Ludema has been at Georgetown University since 1995, where he has a joint appointment in the School of Foreign Service in the Department of Economics. He received his BA from Calvin College in 1983 and his master's degree, MPhil, and PhD degrees in economics from Columbia University, earned the doctorate in 1990. He also had some very interesting and impressive leaves. I'm assuming these were leaves. I don't know how you could do it otherwise. Over the past few years, he served as chief economist of the United States Department of State from 2014 to 2016, and as senior international economist in the White House Office of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2012 to 13. Specializes in an area which is always timely, but has become increasingly of popular interest, especially if you follow Twitter. And that is the area of international trade. So his research interests include the political economy of trade policy, international trade bargaining, preferential trade agreements, trade in the environment, GATT rules, and dispute settlement and economic sanctions. So a big portfolio in the context of trade. And he's here today to speak with us about international institutions and their dispensability. So welcome, Dr. Ludema.
All right.
This one's yours.
So thank you. Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I had made a list of various people to thank, but Kevin has already done that. So thank you once again for all of those who have sponsored this lecture, and the Bruce family for being here as well. As Kevin mentioned, and I also want to mention Alan Heckman, who tirelessly worked to put this all together. And communicated with me on a regular basis to make sure that I was here in good shape. So thank you very much, Ellen. So as you heard in my bio, I am a Calvin alum. So first and foremost, I am a Calvin alum. There you go. Now, I did not have the good fortune to have Professor Pruis in accounting. I think he might have been on leave the year that I took accounting. But I did do an econ major here at Calvin, and I note that two of the professors who actually did teach me are here in the audience. So George Monsma taught me microeconomics, and John Teamstra taught me international economics, which turned out to be very important in my life, because that's what I ended up focusing on as a specialty, and that's what I've been doing for my entire career. So thanks, guys. Appreciate the education. Also, I'm not just a Calvin alumnus, but I am from a Calvin family. I went to Calvin. My wife and I met at Calvin. My parents went to Calvin. My brothers and sisters went to Calvin. Her brothers and sisters went to Calvin. My daughters went to Calvin. And some of them are here with me today, and I'm glad to see them. But you know, when I tell people back east about the commitment that our family had to Calvin College, they look at me funny, like, you know, what kind of a place is this Calvin College? You know, there are other universities in the country. You know, one of my colleagues asked me, you know, did they name a building after you yet? And I had to answer, well, no, actually, we're not all that remarkable of a Calvin family. You know, there's lots of families like ours. So, but anyways, it is great to be part of the Calvin experience, Calvin legacy, and it's really great, I would say, to be back here. This is the first time I've been back here to Calvin to give a lecture, though I've given lectures in many places far and wide. It is especially gratifying to be here. So I'll get on with the topic. So as many of you know, we are living in somewhat uncertain political times. Both in Washington, where I'm from, as well as throughout the country, political extremes seem to be gaining ground, and the middle seems to be shrinking. Moreover, the trajectory of our government and our politics is becoming less and less clear. The election of Donald Trump did nothing to put this uncertainty to rest. Instead, it seems to have exacerbated it. Whether you just support the current president or not, it's pretty clear that President Trump has in mind to upset the status quo. How far will he go? Will he be stopped? Will he stop himself? Will he reverse course? All of these things are big unknowns. And you know, even to somebody like myself, who spent a lot of time in government and watches these things very carefully, it's hard to predict at this stage what's going to happen. So all of this creates political uncertainty. And political uncertainty has implications for economies and for societies. And now when we reflect on this uncertainty, we as Americans often take comfort in the fact that we have a Constitution. And that Constitution contains key rights and principles. It also contains checks and balances, one of which is an independent judiciary, which upholds the Constitution and enforces the law. Given the importance of that during times of political uncertainty, I think it's particularly appropriate that we have a lecture on the rule of law. I know that Professor Pruis cared deeply about the rule of law. And moreover, I think he would agree with me that beyond its value as a stabilizing force in times of political uncertainty, this constitutional approach to government is also very consistent with our Christian values, particularly of the Christian value of justice. So what I mean by that is the Constitution recognizes that there are certain rights that the government cannot take away. And we, following biblical principles, also understand that governments, while instituted by God, are also subordinate to God. And governments must respect the rights of the people, precisely because we, the people, are image bearers of God. So these principles, I think, underlie a lot of the confidence that we as Christians have in the constitutional system. But today's topic is about international relations, or international institutions specifically. And here, we can't really rely on the Constitution. The Constitution stops at our borders. The Constitution does not give us a great deal of guidance as to how we should deal with other countries. However, I would argue that the principles of justice, biblical principle of justice, and to that I would add the biblical principle of stewardship, does give us some guidance as to how we should proceed in world affairs. My understanding of these concepts is that, to put it succinctly, justice and stewardship require us to deal fairly with our neighbors, be they here at home or abroad, as well as to care deeply and act wisely when it comes to our world. So what I'm hoping to do today is think about international relations. I'm going to narrow this focus quite substantially, actually, and talk about my own area of international trade, which is one of the areas of international relations. And the reason I'm going to do so is, first of all, that's my area of specialty, so that's one I know a lot about. Secondly, trade is one of those areas where international institutions are quite highly developed. And thirdly, I want to focus on trade because trade, along with immigration and environmental issues, which are far less developed in terms of institutional structure, are very clearly in the path of the current political storm. So what I'd like to talk about today is, to what extent are the international trade institutions that have been built up over the decades, presidents certainly since Roosevelt have been quite committed to building up international institutions and supporting them and defending them. To what extent are they now, in our current economic and political situation, dispensable? And perhaps, as you can tell from my introduction already, I'm going to argue that they are, while in principle they are dispensable, now is not the time to dispense with them. Anyways, let's get on with the topic. So I'd like to start with a speech that, to those of us who study international trade, was a little bit alarming. So as you know, this administration has adopted a slogan for its approach to international affairs, known as America First. And America First can mean many things to many people. It has a somewhat checkered history if you Google it, but I'm not going to go there. Sometimes what America First is meant to mean is that countries should look after their own. That is, elected officials or leaders of countries should look after their own countries. And I think if you put it that way, it's an unassailable principle. Of course, everybody who's representing a country should be looking after the interests of their country. But what President Trump seemed to indicate that America First meant in his inaugural speech in January is that it involves protecting our borders from the ravages of other countries making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. He argued that protection will lead to great prosperity and strength, and that we should follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. Now, I happen to work for an administration, as you know. I've worked in two administrations, actually. One, I worked in the Bush administration when I was at the International Trade Commission. I worked in the Obama administration in the White House, as well as in John Kerry's State Department. And the principle that was applicable at the time that I was in the State Department, I mean, we believed in America First as well. But what America First meant in that context was American leadership as being vital for the support of the international institutions and order that we had built up over the years. The idea that that we put forth was that we work towards building prosperity and security and freedom in other countries because we believe that doing so builds freedom, security, and prosperity here at home. So that there's a symbiotic relationship between our pursuit of these things abroad as well as at home. So this was a bit of a departure. And it was a little bit of a surprising departure, in my opinion, because when you think about it, Donald Trump himself is stands atop a global business himself, right, with far-flung interests throughout the world. You would think that he would be somewhat more supportive of the international economic setting in which he has, in which the Trump organization has expanded. So it's a bit curious that Trump, of all people, would have come up with an idea like this. In fact, where it actually comes from is this guy. Many of you may know him. This is Steve Bannon. Now, what I like about Steve Bannon is that he puts his cards on the table. You never have any doubt about what Steve Bannon is thinking and where he is going. He's very intentional. Well, Steve Bannon placed Trump in the following context. He actually tried to link Trump's approach to international affairs to historical precedent. And he mentions two things in this quote that I've got here. That Trump combined Jacksonian populism with Hamiltonian economic nationalism to galvanize working-class Americans. What is Jacksonian populism? I don't know if you know your American history all that well, but Andrew Jackson was a president from 1829 to about 1837, and he was the first great populist president. He came into office after during a period similar to what we're living in right now. There was a major financial crisis in 1819 that led to a backlash in the electorate against the elites who were seen to be responsible for the economic collapse. The result was a number of things, one of which was that Jackson was elected, and he was elected on a platform of taking power away from the elites and giving it to the people. Hamilton actually goes a little bit further back than that. Alexander Hamilton, as you know, he was not president, but he was the very first Treasury Secretary of the United States, the Treasury Secretary under George Washington. Hamilton, his economic nationalism refers to the fact that Hamilton was a very protectionist guy. Now, Hamilton was from New York, and at the time, right through most of U.S. history, there was actually a big divide between the North and the South on many issues, but in particular on the issue of international trade. So the South exported cotton, tobacco, and other commodities. And they would export cotton in particular to Europe, where it would then be manufactured into things like cloth and other articles. And then we would import those things. Well, the North in the US was the place where manufacturing was just getting started. And so Hamilton argued that what we need to do is protect the northern manufacturers from cheap imported manufacturers from Europe in order for those manufacturing plants to gain sufficient scale and experience in order to become eventually world class. This logic became known as the infant industry argument, and it is an argument that resonates with developing countries even to this day.
What did you call it?
The infant industry argument. Yeah. Now, economists debate whether or not the infant industry argument is valid, even in the context in which it's applied. But it's very rare to invoke the infant industry argument in the context of a very rich developed country like the United States, and in particular to invoke it for the purpose of giving protection to industries like steel and aluminum and coal. Not exactly the infant industries that come to mind. In any case, that's the tradition in which Steve Bannon designed the America First approach. Now, just to go back a little bit to history, so this is of course not a complete picture of trade policy in the United States, but it is indicative. This shows you the average tariff. So a tariff is a tax on imported products. This is the average tariff imposed on imported products going back to 1820. And as you can see, through much of US history, tariffs were relatively high and also quite volatile. Andrew Jackson came into the presidency immediately following the highest tariff ever on record in the United States, an average tariff rate of 65%, known as the Tariff of Abominations. It was actually called the Tariff of Abominations by the Southerners, who were very upset. And in fact, two states refused to impose those tariffs, citing their own constitutions, saying that it was unconstitutional to have a tariff this high. And it was for that reason that the tariffs came down slightly thereafter. But what you see in this picture is actually, as I said, very high tariffs on average, but also a lot of volatility. And the volatility tended to come from, in part, struggles between North and South, but also every time that there was a financial crisis in the United States, the tariffs would shoot up. Okay? As people became concerned about their bottom lines and said, well, no, we've got to protect ourselves, if not from each other, at least from foreign imports. Now, the last major event we had, the major protectionist event that we had in this country, was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was passed in 1930, immediately following the stock market crash of 1929. This was the beginning of the Great Depression. So after the stock market crashed in 1929, two members of Congress, one a senator, I can't remember which one was the senator and which one was the congressman, but Smoot and Hawley introduced the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act as a way to try and rescue the US economy at a time when domestic demand was shrinking fast. So they hit upon the idea of imposing a very large tariff. Average tariffs went up to about 55%. Imagine, 55% on every imported product. Well, the result, unfortunately, was that not only did the US tariffs go up, but other countries, seeing that we were trying to rescue our domestic industries at the expense of everyone else, responded in kind and raised tariffs of their own. And what we had was a major international trade war, which caused international trade to grind to a halt. And it has been argued that this made the Great Depression more severe and deeper than it needed to be. Now, shortly after the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, Roosevelt took office promising the U.S. a New Deal, a way to get out of the Great Depression. And one of the key elements that he did from an international standpoint was pass something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. That act is with us today. It is the legislation that allows presidents to go out to other countries and negotiate trade agreements on a reciprocal basis. Reciprocal meaning I cut my tariffs, you cut yours. And this is the legislation that allows the president to do that, to then bring these trade agreements back and pass them in Congress on a up or down vote with no amendments. And this has been used for every trade agreement that the United States has signed ever since 1934. Now you can see, just by taking a look at the trend there, that the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act and the institutions that followed that act have done their job. We have not had a protectionist incident, despite many recessions, since 1934. Okay. Now, before we dismiss protectionism entirely, let's look a little bit about what it is that protectionists argue will happen if you impose import protection. Well, it turns out that those arguments are pretty standard. And in fact, they haven't changed much over the centuries. This is an election pamphlet from the GOP election pamphlet from 1910. Now, they didn't do well in that election, but still, at this point in time, the Republicans were the protectionist party in Congress. The Democrats, which were, again, heavily represented by the South, were the free traders. Okay? So the Republicans were arguing the following. They said, you look, a protective tariff will mean employment at high wages. Okay? The home market will be reserved. The greatest home market will be preserved for the U.S. farmer. You'll see an expansion of business. You'll see thriving industry. Whereas under the democratic free trade, what will you get? Well, labor will have to compete with low-paid foreigners. Farmers will face a flood of imports. Industry and business will be depressed. So vote for the protectionist tariff because it is good for the economy. And here's Smoot and Hawley. They seem like perfectly reasonable fellows, don't they? You wouldn't suspect that these guys were protectionists. Well, economists have been equally consistent over the years in their opposition to protectionism. Here just shows you, this is taken from the New York Times in 1930. 1,028 economists asked Hoover to veto the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill. Now, back in 1930, I can't imagine that there were many more than 1,028 economists in the country, so this might be pretty much unanimous. So what are some of the arguments that economists use in order to, why is it that economists don't seem to like protectionism? Well, one of the reasons is that protectionism essentially substitutes the judgment of the government for the judgments of the market when it comes to determining consumption and production decisions, and thereby leads to a misallocation of resources. When you protect one industry, okay, you're going to raise the cost of whatever they're producing for anybody who's consuming the product downstream. Not only that, but you're going to divert resources towards that industry and necessarily divert them away from other industries. So there's no free lunch when you impose protectionism. You're favoring one group at the expense of others, and not necessarily in an efficient way. The second big rap against protectionism is that it blunts market incentives to innovate, to adopt new technologies. And historically, what we've seen is that countries that resort to protectionism on a regular basis tend to fall behind rather than vault ahead of their neighbors technologically. Another argument against protectionism is that our neighbors don't really like it. And when they see us protecting our industries, they respond in kind. This causes retaliation and thereby reduces our access to foreign markets. So not only do we protect our imports, but we also get shut out of foreign markets. Next, it creates uncertainty. And this has actually been the subject of a lot of my recent research. Businesses, when they, what's probably surprising to many of you is that actually not that many businesses engage in international trade. The vast majority of companies really have nothing to do with trade. But the ones that do tend to be fairly large and have to make fairly large investments in order for engagement with the rest of the world to pay off. Many of those investments are sunk cost investments, meaning once you make them, it's very difficult to retrieve or to get them back. Well, uncertainty kills sunk cost investment, because if you cannot plan, right, it's always better to wait and find out what happens than to actually invest and then discover that you were wrong. So investment, particularly sunk cost investment, tend to be very, very sensitive to uncertainty. In fact, I'll just give you an example that from some recent research that I've been doing. You know, China joined the WTO in 2001. What do you suppose China got when it joined the WTO? You probably don't know. Well, let me tell you, they got nothing. The tariffs that the United States and other countries were applying to China prior to them joining the WTO were exactly the same tariffs and other trade barriers that we were applying to them after they joined the WTO. There was no change, because we were already extending them what's known as most favored nation treatment on all of their imports. So there was absolutely no change in the terms of access for Chinese going into the US market or any of the other markets that they sell a lot into. What changed is that their access to our market became permanent. Prior to China's joining the WTO, they were given most favored nation access to the US market, but every couple of years it had to be debated in Congress as to whether or not we were going to continue to do it. And so every couple of years there was a big debate in Congress about whether China had been naughty or nice that year, and whether they would be able to continue receiving most favored nation treatment. And that created a tremendous amount of uncertainty for anybody either wanting to invest in China or any Chinese firm wanting to invest in the necessary upgrades in order to export to a developed market like the US. Once China joined the WTO, those biannual discussions about permanence of the, or about continuation of most favored nation treatment went away, and what you saw is a huge surge of investment in China, precisely in those export industries that standed to gain the most from the elimination of that uncertainty. So uncertainty really does make a big difference when it comes to international trade, and the presence of protectionism, particularly when it has these wild swings in it like we've seen in the past in the US, has a big negative effect on investment. And finally, there's the topic that preoccupied the folks at the State Department where I used to work. One of the main reasons that the US pursues international trade agreements throughout the world is for geopolitical reasons. It is well understood and well documented that countries that trade a lot with each other don't shoot each other. They don't go to war, or it's very rare. So building alliances through trade agreements, as well as trying to reduce war through trade agreements, is a very, very important and real element of why the US has historically pursued trade agreements. And then if you were to ask the folks that I worked with at the State Department when I was there for 2 years, what is the main reason we have trade agreements, they would say this. Now, I would have said some of these other things, but they would say this. So those are the kind of the arguments that we use, or that economists believe are some sound arguments against protectionism. Now, as I mentioned, ever since 1934, we've had in place the institutional structure to bring about lower trade barriers rather than higher. And let me just show you, I don't know, I guess you can see this. So this shows you sort of a series of institutional milestones that have brought about the situation where we are in today. So as I said, it all began with the United States in 1934 passing the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. Now under that act, we signed a bunch of trade agreements in the 1930s, but that pretty much unraveled during the Second World War. Towards the end of the Second World War, the United States and Great Britain, sat down and started to think of some ideas of how we could create an international economic order following the Second World War that would contribute to both prosperity and security for all countries concerned. And actually they went back to some ideas that had been put out earlier in the 1920s in the Charter of the League of Nations, and sought to put together some economic institutions. And they called a conference in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. A bunch of countries showed up. And out of that conference emerged a number of things. Well, the first that emerged was an institution known as the International Monetary Fund. That institution was set up to administer a return to the gold standard, which had been dropped during the Great Depression and the war. And another institution that was set up alongside the IMF was a bank International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was supposed to help give loans to countries to rebuild after the war. Its mission changed a number of years later, and it became known as the World Bank. So the World Bank was also set up in Bretton Woods in 1944. Now, the intent in 1944 was to set up a third organization called the International Trade Organization. But that was the most controversial and complex of the three, and so negotiations actually did not conclude in 1944. But negotiations did take place in 1946 and 47, and what emerged was an agreement called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947. And that was a multilateral agreement. Initially, it only included 23 countries, but it grew. And that was the main institutional framework in which trade agreements thereafter took place. Just a few other notable milestones. About 10 years later, 6 countries in the European Union, or 6 countries in Europe, decided to create the European Economic Community. Now at the time, their reasoning was that they wanted to go deeper in uniting their economies, deeper than it was foreseen even in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. But they went to the GATT and asked permission to create what's known as a customs union. And the U.S. supported that. And the reason that the U.S. supported the EEC was precisely this security argument that I mentioned before, that they wanted to eliminate or reduce the possibility of a third world war starting in Europe, as well as to bolster the Europeans against the communist threat coming from the Soviet Union at the time. Well, fast forward a few years and we have the North American Free Trade Agreement. So in 1994, the U.S. joined with Canada and Mexico to do something similar to what the EEC had done, that is create not a customs union but was known as a free trade area, in which there would be free trade in North America. In 1995, the 123 countries of the GATT, so GATT grew from 23 countries originally to 123, and by 1995, decided to expand the scope of that agreement, add a significant dispute settlement mechanism, and change the name. So they changed it to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And then the very last of the big milestones, and these took place fairly recently. They were negotiated during the Obama administration. The U.S. tried to negotiate 2 major agreements. One was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was negotiated with a dozen or so countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including Canada and Mexico, Japan, and several others. We concluded that negotiation, but it was not ratified before the end of the administration. We also launched a negotiation with the European Union to create what's known as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That negotiation was not concluded and is now currently on hold. So I put a question mark there because it's not clear whether we will ever reach the Trans-Pacific or Transatlantic Partnership milestones. Anyways, that's just a brief history of where we've been and where we've come in terms of international institutions. Now I want to talk a little bit about the WTO because it is the key international institution governing international trade. It sort of stands above all. It has 160 members now. Pretty much every reasonable country in the world is a member of the WTO. And it gives everybody certain rights and responsibilities. So what exactly does the WTO do? Contrary to popular belief, WTO doesn't tell countries what to do. The WTO provides a forum for negotiation of market access commitments on a non-discriminatory basis. That is, we reduce our trade barriers if we want to. We don't have to, but we can negotiate the reduction in trade barriers with other countries on a non-discriminatory basis. Everybody is entitled to that same treatment. It also provides rules to protect the integrity of the agreed upon commitments. So most of what you hear about, if you hear about WTO rules, those rules are in place to protect the integrity of what has been agreed on in point 1. That is, if I agree to say, okay, your country can have access to my market in exchange for my country having access to your market, okay, what we need to make sure of is that the next day you don't turn around and say, oh, and by the way, all of the customs officials that have to clear your product before they come into the country, they're going to take a coffee break when your products come by. All right? Not allowed to do that. Okay? There's a rule against that. No coffee breaks for customs officials. Okay, that's not really true, but there are rules like that. Because you have to ensure the integrity of those commitments. It also creates a forum for the settlement of disputes. It is a quasi-judicial arrangement. It has judges and countries bring their cases against one another. And as a litigating device, that has actually been really, really effective. But the other thing to know about the WTO is that it has lots and lots of built-in flexibilities. Because remember, I started my talk by saying, hey, we live in some pretty crazy political times. And the WTO was aware of that not just the US, but lots of countries experience politically uncertain times. Times when calls for protectionism are present, and when sometimes politically they simply can't be denied. And it's for this reason that the WTO built in lots of flexibility. So for example, it allows countries to temporarily impose protection, right, under certain circumstances. So as long as a country follows the rules in applying their temporary protection, they can go ahead and do so and respond to a politically necessary demand for protectionism. There's also exceptions to the WTO in which countries can justify stepping back from their WTO commitments for certain cases, to protect health, public health, to protect the environment, or for national security purposes. All of these things are entirely permissible under the WTO. And indeed, the dispute settlement system itself has built-in flexibilities. Suppose I violate a WTO rule. The WTO will find against me, right, and authorize whoever I've harmed to seek redress. And that redress, if I remain recalcitrant, may end up being a trade sanction. But at the end of the day, if I'm willing to live with that trade sanction and keep my violation in place, I'm allowed to do so. There's no military that will come and tell me, okay, no, you can't do that. And this has happened. The European Union, for example, banned importation of hormone-fed beef from the United States. The US complained. Our farmers complained. They said, hey, hormone-fed beef isn't bad for you. There's no reason you should be banning it. They said, no, we think it's bad for us. Well, produce the scientific evidence, we said. They couldn't produce the scientific evidence, so the WTO ruled against them. They said, sorry, we don't care if there's no scientific evidence. We're not importing hormone-fed beef. So we went to the WTO and said, we want the right to retaliate against the Europeans for that. The WTO granted us that right. We imposed tariffs on imported French cheese in retaliation. And still the French said, or still the European Union said, okay, it really was the French, but it really was the French driving this whole thing. But no, they said, still, we're not going to import that hormone-fed beef. You can't make us. And to this day, they are not importing hormone-fed beef, right? Because you're allowed to. Right? If it means that much to you, you can back out of your commitments, even under the existing dispute settlement system. But there's one big unwritten rule in the WTO, and that is that all of these flexibilities should be used in moderation. It never says that anywhere in the agreement, but it says, be careful about using these. Do not abuse the system. Because if you abuse the system, everybody's going to abuse the system. And if everybody abuses the system, it's going to be chaos. And you're going to be right back to where you were in 1930 with a trade war. So it's really up, there's the black and white, there's the big institutions, there's the big brick walls, but at the end of the day, what it comes down to is don't do what you wouldn't want others to do. Respect the institution, use the flexibilities when you need to, and it should be clear to your partners, to your trading partners, that this is a necessary use of those flexibilities. So are trade agreements dispensable? I would argue no, but they should be flexible. But flexibility requires a certain degree of responsibility and a certain respect for one's neighbors before the whole thing will work. We can destroy the world trading system pretty easily by simply disregarding that big unwritten rule. So next what I would like to do, how are we doing on time? Next what I would like to do is talk a little bit about some of the new realities facing the world economy, and whether or not those new realities require us to rethink our existing institutions and maybe come up with different or better ones. The first is that technology has changed the global economy very profoundly. And it has particularly impacted the United States in reducing the labor intensity of manufacturing and increasing the demand for skill. We often hear, and it's politically convenient to say so, that manufacturing in this country is on the decline. Manufacturing is not on the decline. I repeat, not on the decline. Manufacturing as a share of GDP, that is the amount of manufacturing output we produce as a share of our total output, has been absolutely rock solid since 1970. That's as far back as I have data, okay? In fact, it's even a little bit up right now. Okay? What has declined is the share of employment in manufacturing. It's employment in manufacturing that has declined, not manufacturing. We produce more manufacturers with fewer workers. Okay? And that's primarily a technological effect. So when we talk about protecting our domestic industry from imported products in order to save jobs, well, back in the 1930s, that may have made a little bit of sense because there were actually a lot of people producing our products. Now, if you protect the auto industry, you're going to give a lot of jobs to some robots. And some high-skilled workers who know how to operate those robots. But very few actually, very little employment is actually going to be generated by protection in these types of industries. Second thing, that as the labor force has moved out of manufacturing, it has moved into the services sector. We live in an economy now where 80% of us work in the services sector. But not only that, but the United States has a very strong comparative advantage in the production and export of services. So here is the famous trade deficit that at various times we worry about. And what you can see is that the trade deficit, what I've done here is I've divided up our trade balance into 3 different categories. We have a trade deficit in petroleum, that is we import more oil than we export. We also have a trade deficit in goods. But what we have is a very large surplus in services. That is, we export more services than we import. And that's started small. I mean, this is just from 2006. You can already see that it's grown quite substantially. So what we should be thinking about when it comes to international trade, particularly if you're interested in the US economy, is trying to break down barriers to trade in services rather than thinking about trying to erect barriers in order to protect domestic manufacturing. Because that is the direction the economy is going, whether we try to put a stop to it or not. And the truth is that services are much more protected throughout the world than goods are. Countries throughout the world have relatively low tariffs on goods. Okay? But services, there are barriers all over the place. But we're not addressing that right now. Well, we tried to address it in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it didn't go so far. But the point is, well, I'll get to that. Okay. This just shows you the same thing. If you look at where employment is growing and where employment is shrinking, you see that employment is shrinking in manufacturing, it's growing in services, and it's the fastest growing area of employment is in tradable services. That is, services that can be exported.
Could you give us an example of a tradable service?
The tradable services include things like legal services, accounting services, so business services of that sort. Also royalties from intellectual property is a big source of services. Tourism services, air services, air travel services, and so on. So there's lots of, those are all tradable services. Right? What people don't realize is that if a foreigner comes and goes to Disney World, that we're actually exporting a service. Even though it's taking place on US soil, we're exporting a service when a foreigner buys a concession at Disney World. Global value chains, you've probably heard about those. The only point I want to make here is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to know where a product is produced. Think about the phone in your pocket. Classic example, the iPhone. Where does the iPhone come from? Where do we get it? China. Every single iPhone in the world comes from China. And every single iPhone is recorded as an import 100% from China. So whatever the $500 or whatever it is to import an iPhone from China, that counts as $500 worth of imports from China. Well, how much of the value of an iPhone is actually coming from China? Very, very little. In fact, roughly $2 worth. All of the rest of it comes from other countries. Parts get shipped into China where they're assembled and then they get shipped back out the door. Very little value added comes from China in the case of the iPhone. Now, that's an extreme example. But it's not all that extreme. I mean, this shows you how much of the value of a country's exports are actually foreign content. Right? Now, for the US, it's actually very little. Most of what we export, we produce here, using parts produced here. Okay? But for a lot of other countries, it's a very different story. China in particular. Approximately 35% of all of the value of Chinese exports is imports from other countries. Parts that are imported from other countries and then shipped through China. So when you start talking about putting up import protection on various products, you have to be really careful. Because you may be, well, because nobody's talking about putting a tax on imported iPhones, but you tax a product, tax an automobile, or tax an airplane or something like that. chances are a lot of the content of that product is actually American made. So you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? And that's very different than the way it used to be back in the 30s, when you had a pretty good chance of, well, if you protect against an imported product, that you were going to be, at least harming the foreigners, not your own firm. Of course, there's been the growth of the emerging markets. No secret there. China and India long lagged behind the US in terms of per capita income, but they're starting to catch up. And that has created big challenges for the WTO. So the first challenge for the WTO is the anti-globalization movement. That's more or less coming from the left. But the bigger challenge, I think, is within the WTO. Right now, the WTO is divided between the emerging markets, who have one agenda, and the rich countries, the traditional powerhouses in the WTO, the US, the European Union, Japan, and other countries, on the other side. And they have a very different agenda. What we want is lower trade barriers on services. What they want is not that. Okay? And so, well, they have other priorities. The discussions in the WTO have gone nowhere since 1995. There has been no major new agreement signed under the auspices of the WTO since 1995. Well, there was one little one called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, but basically the WTO has become a forum for litigation of trade disputes. It has kind of lost its value as a forum for negotiation because the two sides right now are still too far divided. So if anything, the problem with the WTO is not that it's a big monster telling all the countries what to do. The problem with the WTO right now is that it's in a stalemate. It can't move forward. But what has moved forward are preferential trade agreements. Now, I mentioned the European Union and the NAFTA. Those are examples of preferential trade agreements. But preferential trade agreements have exploded since 1994. Okay? Nearly every country is a member of dozens of preferential trade agreements right now. And this is actually an important, this is an important development because what it says is that almost all of the impetus for liberalization has shifted out of the multilateral WTO context and into the regional bilateral context. But countries are signing these things as fast as they can. All right? And it has created a big mess. This is what's known as this is just the American Asia-Pacific spaghetti bowl. Okay, it's called the spaghetti bowl because of all of the things that look like noodles. Right? These are all trade agreements, right? And they overlap, right? And so when you're importing a product into a particular country, there's a whole book. Which trade agreement are you importing your product under? Okay, now we have to look and we'll see what the tariff is for that product, right? Under that agreement. Right? It's very complicated. And every single one of these agreements has different rules of origin, all sorts of different components to it. And one of the things that we were trying to do with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership was to try and take a bunch of these agreements and wrap them together into a single unified whole so that they would be less incoherent or more coherent. Right? That is, they would have single rules that would apply to all the member countries. So it was an attempt to get rid of the spaghetti bowl problem. But when we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the important thing to notice is that just because we stop signing trade agreements doesn't mean other countries are going to stop signing trade agreements. And every single one of those trade agreements that other countries sign are preferential towards their members and therefore discriminatory against US products. So, you can take a time out, but the other countries of the world are not taking a time out. In fact, we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the other members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership are proceeding with it. Right? And pretty soon, we're going to be left out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and if we ever want to get back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we're going to have to negotiate our way in, and we're going to have a much weaker bargaining position than we had in the beginning. So, the world's not standing still if this current administration wants it to stand still. It's not going to do it. So finally, I want to just talk a little bit about what the Trump administration has been up to. Okay, It said goodbye to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's a little joke there, little Japan joke, because Japan was a big member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So he signed that away. Then he said he wanted to get rid of NAFTA, but agreed to engage in renegotiation of NAFTA. Okay? The reason he didn't like, well, he on the campaign trail, he basically said that NAFTA was the worst trade deal of all time. Okay? Of all time. Okay? And Bill Clinton signed it. Okay? Well, guess what? NAFTA negotiations were initiated by Ronald Reagan. Okay? NAFTA was negotiated by George H.W. Bush. And yes, signed by Bill Clinton, but only after the Democrats forced him to put labor and environmental standards into it. Right? And then he signed it. Okay? So yes, technically he signed it, but I wouldn't say Clinton was responsible for NAFTA. Anyways, NAFTA is the worst trade agreement of all time. So what we're going to do is renegotiate it. Well, how are we going to renegotiate it? How are we going to get the Canadians and the Mexicans to agree to something? Well, here's an idea. Let's take all the stuff that was in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and put it into NAFTA. So this is just a very long laundry list of things, topics that they're discussing right now. The first half of them, in fact, the only ones that everybody sort of more or less agrees on, are the things that were already in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, such as improving labor and environmental standards, promoting the digital economy, modifying investor-state dispute settlement, addressing government procurement, and so on. So those are the proposals on which we can actually agree. And if at the end of the day we reach an agreement, a renegotiated NAFTA with the components of the TPP in them, I'll actually be happy. I'm not happy the Trans-Pacific Partnership was killed, but at least some of that stuff got into NAFTA. The problem is that the administration has made some proposals that are going to be completely unacceptable to our trading partners. They've already signaled that. One of the things that they want to do is demand, so currently for a car, a US, or for an automobile that's produced in North America to be sold duty-free in North America, it has to have 65% North American content. They want to up that to 85%, okay. But then 50% of that has to be US. Okay. So what that means is that it's entirely possible for Canada to have to impose a tariff on an imported car because it doesn't contain enough American content. That would be the implication of this rule. It contains too much Canadian content, so we have to put a tax on it. It's not going to be acceptable. The other big one is the 5-year sunset provision. So under that proposal, NAFTA would expire after 5 years unless all 3 countries agreed to continue it. Okay? Now, remember I told you the story about China and the WTO and how, right? Once that
uncertainty.
Right, exactly. Once they stopped having to debate whether or not China could continue to have access to the US market every 2 years, that there was a surge in imports. Well, this does exactly the same thing except for in reverse. It adds a 5-year review of NAFTA. And so every 5 years there's going to be a big debate about whether or not we should continue NAFTA. And if you're a company and you're trying to operate in this environment, you're going to be very reluctant to make a sunk cost investment when the discussion about NAFTA is 1 or 2 years away from here. Okay, so it's a terrible idea from an economic standpoint. And there's a bunch of other terrible ideas, but you know, I think you kind of get the point. This just shows you that, well, let's forget about that. Finally, and this is where I'll end. I realize I'm running over time. What the administration is currently doing is making much more active use of existing trade laws. And as I told you before, those flexibilities are there to be used. And this administration is using them. And, however, there are a number of somewhat disconcerting signs. One of the first things they decided to do was to launch national security investigations on steel and aluminum imports. If those are if the Commerce Department determines, or if the government actually determines, that steel and aluminum are necessary for national security, then we can impose duties on imported steel and aluminum for that purpose. Now, this is a really big deal, because remember I said, don't abuse the system? If this is perceived to be abusing the system, it is going to be really, really bad for the WTO, because every country can protect any product it wants by invoking national security. Once you invoke national security, the discussion's over, right? There's no argument against we're doing this for national security reasons. And it's for this reason that countries have never actually used, or have very rarely used, the national security exemption. The only thing we use national security exemption for is restricting things like sales of arms, right? But to say, okay, well now the steel industry needs to be protected. The steel industry, which has been asking for protection for the last 40 years and getting it for the most part, now all of a sudden they need to have protection because of national security reasons. Everybody's going to smell a rat. And as soon as they do that, everybody's going to invoke national security, and we're going to have pandemonium on our hands. So currently the Defense Department is against this, and I hope that Trump listens to the generals. He often does, which is great news. And if he does, this should die a slow death, or an appropriate death. Then there's a whole bunch of other ones. There's actually a unilateral investigation of China on intellectual property and forced technology transfer. This one is actually one that I don't think is that bad. It's unilateral, yes, which is not a great idea. But it does address, I think, a real concern and a real area where I think China has been exploiting loopholes in the WTO and needs to be called out on it. And so I'm actually not 100% opposed to this one. And then there's a bunch of other temporary trade barriers that we're imposing. But what's interesting about the temporary trade barriers that we are imposing in recent years is that most of them are hitting countries that are our friends. You probably heard the biggest, latest one was on imports of Bombardier aircraft from Canada. Okay? So the U.S. imposed really big tariffs on aircraft from Canada. Now, by itself, that's not a big deal. It's a perfectly legal thing for the U.S. to do under existing trade laws, under those flexibilities that I mentioned. But Trump decided to take a victory lap when we did it, and told everybody, hey, look, we're protecting the U.S. from those evil Canadians, and essentially forced heads of state in both Canada and the UK to come out and denounce it. Okay? Now, that's not supposed to happen. Right? This is supposed to happen completely under the radar. All of this type of temporary protection, it's supposed to happen at the administrative level. Okay, you impose tariffs because you need to. But you never talk about it at the level of the head of state. Because once you start talking about these things at the head of state level, right, you're forcing the heads of state, right, to defend themselves against the incursion from the other guy in a very public way. And that ruins international trade relations, and it also ruins international relations on a whole bunch of other issues as well. So it's really important that if we're going to use these flexibilities in the agreement, that we do so in a quiet and orderly manner. Okay? So that's all I'll talk about. I just want to conclude with two parting thoughts. The first parting thought actually comes by way of my father, my late father, Ken Ludema. Ken Ludema was, by his own admission, a conservative. He always voted Republican, and he always drove Oldsmobiles, until Oldsmobile went out of business, and then he had to settle for Buicks. But I remember him once telling me why it is that he thought conservatism was a sensible political posture. And he said, basically, it's because conservatives don't deviate too much from the status quo. And they do so, or they should be doing so, out of a sense of humility. You don't always know everything. You don't always know everything. And you shouldn't assume that the guy who was in office, regardless of what side of the aisle they're from, before you, didn't know anything. Chances are they were pretty smart. So what we have in international trade is a legacy dating back to, at least back to FDR. supported by Republican and Democratic presidents in the interest of both trade as well as international relations. Don't mess it up. Don't mess it up. At least don't mess it up in a hurry. That's one piece of advice I would give to this administration. And then I would also cite my old boss, who was always an optimist. And he basically argued, look, don't worry, Trump's going to figure this out. Because, you know, whatever he might have said on the campaign trail, whatever he might have promised, once you get in that office, reality comes at you very fast. Okay? And reality always has a way of asserting itself. And eventually he's going to come around to the right decisions. And I am hoping, along with Obama, that that is the case. So that's all I have to say. Thank you. I guess I'll put this back.
So thank you, and you have covered a lot of territory.
I know.
Biblical
Probably too much.
Justice, softwood lumber, trade agreements, everything in between. So, but I do want to take some time, and I'm sure there are questions given what's been covered. So, please, and do you want to just, especially since I think we have to restate them, perhaps, into the mic.
That's right. So you state the question. I'll restate it into the mic because these guys need to hear it. Yes.
You had a list of the temporary trade barriers, and some of those things make no sense to me. Something, you have Kazakhstan and Australia and Brazil all in the same category for a particular product. How does that happen?
Well, it's a very, very lengthy and well, excruciatingly difficult process. But you basically launch an investigation to each and every one of those countries to determine whether or not they have been selling their product at something called less than fair value. They've been dumping those products. And so it takes lots of lawyers and lots of economists to sift through all the data and determine whether or not that's the case. But so basically,
even though the countries appear unrelated, it's the value of the product that is being manipulated.
Exactly. And I just realized I violated rule number 1. I didn't restate your question. Yes?
What would you cite as an example, or a couple of examples of maybe the farthest bending of the WTO, sort of golden rule that you cited?
So I mentioned the national security exemption, or exemption for steel, and or the national security investigation. Oh yeah, the question was. The question was, what is the clearest example of bending of the WTO rules? I mentioned the national security one. I think that that's probably a pretty big deal, and if that goes through, it could be a problem. But they haven't done it yet. The only thing that one thing they have done, which I didn't mention, is that the administration is currently blocking the appointment of appellate judges in the WTO. So there's a panel of 7 judges in the WTO that hears all of the appeals on all disputes within the WTO. It needs 4 to function, okay? And 2 of them are now being blocked by the U.S. One of them is about to retire in December, and another one will retire in the spring. So if no new judges are appointed, the WTO dispute settlement would grind to a halt. Now the reason that we're blocking the appointment of judges is because there's been a number of cases in recent years that have gone against the U.S. And this is not just the Obama administration, not just the Trump administration. The Obama administration played these same games. They, at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, they believe that they are never wrong. And if a WTO panel finds against the U.S., then it must be that that WTO panel is reading into the agreement obligations that the U.S. never agreed to. Right? So they see them as activist judges, adding their own opinions into obligations that the U.S., by definition, we couldn't have agreed to that because we would never have violated the agreement, right? So I think that's going to get us in trouble, right? If we are seen as actively undermining the dispute settlement procedure, it's going to get us in trouble because not only do we, sometimes prevent rulings from going our way, but if we completely undermine dispute settlement, we also won't get rulings when we need them, when we're challenging China on a number of the things that we challenge them on. So I think that's a dangerous game we're playing. I think in the back.
And as we back off from some of these trade agreements, what's the impact on environmental and human rights areas?
So the question is, as we back out of trade agreements, what's the impact on human rights and on environmental issues? So I would say not good, because so the Trans-Pacific Partnership in particular, one of the chapters that I was most proud of was actually so the NAFTA includes chapters on labor and environmental rights, basically obligating the members of NAFTA to not use trade policy without paying attention to environmental impact, as well as committing to various labor rights like the right to unionization and things of that sort. But in the NAFTA, those are non-binding, right? If you violate them, there's no consequence. They're just aspirational goals written into the agreement. In TPP, we made them legally binding, so that if you violate those rules, you can actually, a country can bring a dispute against you and you can actually get sanctioned. So adding teeth to labor and environmental standards chapters, as well as, I would add another one, which is having a chapter on small and medium-sized enterprises designed to promote small and medium-sized enterprises engaging more in international trade. Some of these things were, I think, very, very sensible, and I think good for the environment, good for labor rights, good for other things. Without the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's kind of in limbo. As I said, there's a chance that those labor and environmental chapters could become enforceable in a renegotiated NAFTA. And if that's the case, that would be a step in the right direction. But we can't get any of that stuff done at the WTO because China, India, and these guys won't let us. So we have to do it through regional agreements if we're going to do it at all. You had a question.
Assuming that Mr. Trump has a lot of impact on the current administration,
Yeah.
is there any way you could help reality assert itself by making this presentation to President Trump?
I don't know if he would hear me out. I have made presentations like this on many occasions in other contexts. So I think that in the near term the answer is no. I think that the president has put key people in place who very much want to see trade agreements grind to a halt, protectionism go up. So Wilbur Ross in the Commerce Department, Robert Lighthizer in the U.S. Trade Representative's office, and Peter Navarro, who's a White House advisor. These guys are basically put in charge, and until something really blows up in their face, I think he's going to continue to let them be in charge. But who knows?
It's pretty
Obama believes, so I believe. Okay.
It's pretty powerful.
Yeah. In the back on the right. Yeah.
Thanks very much for this. It's very helpful.
Thank
I get the point about how volatility and unpredictability prevents growth and investment.
Yeah.
So then just help me understand why the stock market seems to love where we are right now. Because aren't those companies on the Dow Jones, don't they have international stakes? And so how can we correlate those two things?
So the question is, if there's so much uncertainty, why is the stock market doing so well, essentially? Yeah. Very interesting question. The stock market, so the share prices don't necessarily reflect the type of uncertainty that I'm talking about. I mean, you can have companies investing very little, right, and still have their stock prices going through the roof for other reasons. I think that there are things that the Trump administration is doing that are perceived by the markets favorably. I think all the talk about cutting corporate income taxes, for example, is providing some boost to the markets. You know, international trade isn't everything. It's everything to me, but it's only about 10% of the U.S. economy. I mean, it's about 25% of the world economy. So for other countries, it's a lot bigger deal than for us. But there's a lot in the economy that is you know, employment is good. Growth has been pretty healthy. So there's a lot that's positive about the economy. Some of it the result of perceptions about Trump. Others, you know, just because the economy was doing well when he took over. But that's why the stock market, in my opinion, is doing well. But I can show you some other evidence that actually the uncertainty has actually impacted shares in the specific areas where the uncertainty is greatest. But that's, you know, you're not going to see that in the Dow Jones Industrial Averages. Yeah. Jim.
President Trump's argument seems to be that you and your predecessors negotiated bad deals.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, what do you say to that? I mean, what was your goal when you were negotiating the deals, and did you negotiate some bad deals?
So, did we negotiate bad deals? So, first of all, I personally was not directly involved in any of the negotiations. I was always an analyst, and sort of explaining how these things worked. No, I don't think it's fair to say that we negotiated bad deals. We negotiated the absolute best deals we could get. And until I see a better deal negotiated, I am going to have a hard time believing that we were too weak or anything like that. I mean, we ignore. I mean, so one of the things that the Trump administration has pointed to as evidence that some of our deals are bad, particularly NAFTA is bad, is because we run a bilateral trade deficit with Mexico. That is, we import more from Mexico than we export. Well, that's never been the metric that anybody has used to judge whether or not a trade deal is good or bad, right? Because bilateral trade deficits as an economic concept are completely meaningless. I have a bilateral trade deficit with my dentist. Okay? My dentist supplies me with services, but I supply him with none. Okay? On the other hand, I have a bilateral trade surplus with my students. I supply them with services, and they don't supply me with any. Right? And nobody thinks that's a problem, okay? Because it's not. Okay? Now, the overall trade deficit, that is the fact that we import in total more than we export, that has an economic meaning. The economic meaning is it means that we're borrowing from the rest of the world. Now, you could spin that one of two ways. You could say, oh, well, it's great that foreign countries want to invest in the United States. Or you could say, look, profligate Americans, they spend more than they earn. Right? But it has nothing to do with trade agreements. Right? And in fact, if you want to reduce the trade deficit, the best way to do so is to reduce the amount that the U.S. borrows. Right? So you have to sort of call into question whether or not we should be adding $1.5 trillion to the debt, right, at a time that we're already running at full employment with the big tax cut that's being talked about in Congress right now. Anyways, I'm not coming out against the tax cut. I know that there's a lot of people who like it, but the point is that that's where trade deficits matter. I mean, trade deficits matter in that space. They have really absolutely nothing to do with with trade negotiations. So it's a false way to judge whether or not we have a fair or unfair trade agreement. If you look at NAFTA, okay, the typical way to judge whether or not we got a good deal is to look at how far trade barriers went down on both sides. Okay? Our average trade barrier going into NAFTA, right, was about, on imported products from Canada and Mexico, was about 2.5%. Those then dropped to 0 as a result of NAFTA. Mexico had average tariffs of about 12%. Right? That went down to 0. So by that measure, we got a great deal. They cut their trade barriers a lot. We cut our trade barriers very little. And if things were reversed, right, we would go back up to those types of levels, and actually we would have a much harder time getting into the Mexican market than the Mexicans would have getting into our market if we were to abandon NAFTA. So, you know, I'm using traditional metrics. This administration is using a different metric. I would argue that that metric is irrelevant.
So maybe we could have one more question, and I'd love for it to be from a student. Laurel, you had your hand up a second ago. Is it passed you by? You still have a question?
I still have my question, but I don't know much about international politics or economics. So
Okay.
I don't know how much this question is just speaking to my lack of knowledge. But what is the impact of withdrawing from these trades on nonprofit organizations, particularly nonprofit organizations that are in the U.S. but have services and goods created and made in foreign countries and bought as like a missionary organization?
Right. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know what the sort of import and export picture is for nonprofits, but I mean, I certainly, when it comes to, I mean, I know that there are a lot of charitable organizations that do, you know, buy local handicrafts in rural Mexico to ship to the U.S. That would become more difficult. Now, as I said, it wouldn't become hugely more difficult because, as I say, U.S. tariffs in any event aren't all that high. But it certainly wouldn't be beneficial. Okay? What it may do, though, is create a lot more need for charitable organizations to do work in Mexico, because I think it would significantly reduce the level of economic activity in Mexico, at least temporarily, and probably create a lot more poverty.
Well, let's end it there. We may have a little bit of time to linger here if you have a question that you wanted to address afterwards, but in the meantime, would you join me in thanking?
Thank you.